1963, I was working as a copy boy for the Kansas City Star. Sometimes after the final edition was put to bed, the reporters and editors would sit around and mull over the events of the day, especially if it was a special edition of the paper. On one of those nights, a senior reporter who was sitting over in the corner, I guess decided to take a break, and he walked over and sat down, and he had just returned from a junket sponsored by the Pentagon for reporters to go and see what was going on in Vietnam. That was the first time I'd ever heard of the words deception and lies spoken about the Vietnam War. In 1967, in fact, Governor George Romney of Michigan characterized those junkets as whitewash. This particular reporter's take on the war at that point was that the military needed a war. They had not done well in Korea, and during the Cold War there weren't a lot of chances for those kinds of engagements. They were looking to earn their medals and ribbons and make a name for themselves. There were a number of other reasons for why the United States decided to get involved in the war. In 1954, the French were defeated by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu. At that time, President Eisenhower made a speech expressing his concern about the fact that if French Indochina fell to communism, there was a real possibility that the other countries in Southeast Asia would also fall. Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, maybe even India. He called it the domino theory, and that became the overriding theme of those who wanted us to become active in South Vietnam. At the same time, there were a number of foreign policy considerations based on the Cold War. One was that Russia could not compete directly with the United States as far as armaments and influence in Western countries was concerned, so they turned their attention to small, impoverished countries where they could attempt to influence the populace and perhaps turn them into being communists and socialists. So the fear of communism was predominant in the State Department. John Foster Dulles, Dean Rusk, who became Secretary of State after his death, were proponents of what became known as American exceptionalism, the idea that we were the victors in World War II and we were really we saved the West from falling into Hitler's hands. And that because of that, we probably were the greatest influence in the world at that time, and that we could exert our influence over other countries to develop democracies like our own. And it was also that we should use our newfound power for economic advantage. They developed the principles of containment to contain the Russians, also of a way of negotiating or not negotiating called brinksmanship, one-upsmanship. In a sense, they were, in retrospect, expressing some kind of what amounted to hubris or an overblown idea of what America could accomplish in the world. Now, about the same time that I worked at the Star, one of my professors in college asked the class to read this book, A Nation of Sheep, by the sociologist William Lederer. Lederer had two major premises for the book. One, that the American people were not aware of the fact that the U.S. had been conducting a secret war in Laos, and yet no one was bringing it to their attention. He also castigated the press, which today is known as the media, for being complicit with the federal government and not doing their duty as reporters and digging out the facts and bringing them to the attention of the American people. Going forward now to 1966, with the Vietnam War in full force, President Johnson and Secretary of State McNamara became aware at that time that the war could not be won. One of the principal reasons was that the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and that it was despised by a majority of people actually in North and South Vietnam. They found that the war was actually a popular uprising against the remnants of French colonialism. For over 100 years, the French had exploited the natural resources of Vietnam. And the leaders of the South Vietnamese government were among that class of Vietnamese who colluded with the French. So it turned out in many ways that we were fighting for the wrong side, that the uprising had a point, that they had been treated unjustly and they wanted to have their own country. The biggest problem with the Vietnam War then was that knowing this, that we could not win the war. In fact, President Kennedy, it's been rumored, knowing that the South Vietnamese government was corrupt, was seriously considering pulling out of Vietnam. So instead of bringing the war to a halt, Johnson and several congressional friends of his and officials in the State Department, for fear of perhaps losing face or political advantage, decided to escalate the war. Johnson said so in one of his tapes, in one of his telephone conversations. What am I going to do? If I get out of this war, I'm going to be blamed for its failure. It was after that time, 1966, that the U.S. suffered its greatest number of casualties, and that the largest number of Vietnamese civilians were killed. They also suffered today from the effects of Agent Orange and napalm and other chemicals that were sprayed on the foliage, and it's in the water and in the ground. In 1968, Richard Nixon, who was candidate for president, decided to go around the government and negotiated secretly with the South Vietnamese government, promising them a better deal if they waited until after the election when he was president. He did this in order to gain advantage over Hubert Humphrey, who was the Democratic nominee. If the peace settlement that was in progress had been made before the election, Humphrey would have almost certainly won the election. Nixon said in 1970, "I'm not going to be the first president to lose the war." So he was operating on the same premise that he did not want to lose face, that he didn't want the United States to actually lose a war, because we'd never had done so before. The second subject of A Nation of Sheep was we the people. Later noticed that Americans were afraid to confront the government on serious issues, that the American public was passive, complacent, apathetic about world affairs. And I can sort of understand that. The country had been through the Great Depression, long World War II, a lot of sacrifices along the way. We had just won the war. We were riding high. It was time to celebrate, to have fun. It's kind of like Cyndi Lauper song, "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." People just wanted to enjoy themselves. But they did so at a loss of knowing what was going on in the country. And so the government ran on for a while on its own path without people being aware of what was actually happening. And in fact, it would seem like after a while they just got tired of the war anyway and didn't care. It was just another item on the evening news. When I was sitting there, back there in 1963, I was about 19 years old. I never thought that I would become part of a generation that I would later call the last lambs of the nation of sheep. I discovered that image when I was writing the poem I'm about to read, The Last Lambs of the Nation of Sheep. The poem is called The Last Days of the Eisenhower Administration. And that was when the young priest just out of the seminary, opened the parish gym on weeknights to keep us off the streets, wanted us to box and wrestle and play basketball, cornered us one by one, demanding to know how many times since our last confession we spilled our holy seed, promised us paradise if we held our fists out of our pants long enough to wait and sacrifice. And when girls like Rosemary from the convent school poked against us in the wild, windy midnights, their mothers in ragged gowns hissing through cracks in screen doors, girls like Rosemary who panted until their skin shook, then stepped back because the good sisters implored them not to step down, sent us home feverish to wait for something better and sacrifice. And when the police stalked us through the glaring, dangerous streets because we happened to be there, Mexican, black, youngest in a family of 10, and we searched alleys and trash bins looking for booze or fistfights, something to steal or break, running from the young priest who wanted us to box and wrestle and play basketball, tell him how many times that week we hungered for girls like Rosemary, with their scented hair in the warm place we could feel through their skirts. And when the flashing red eyes of patrol cars turned a corner suddenly, we hid under old Chevys, ripped our shirts and our skin rolling over fences to escape being slammed against paddy wagons, to escape being beaten into better boys, willing and ready to sacrifice. And when the ex-football player, the ex-Marine, the all-Christian athlete campaigning for city council came to our school to tell us of the vision he had for our future and explain how he once felt as we did, felt he knew everything, but now he knew better, knew how we could create a better world and be like our forefathers, the founders of the Republic, the great generals, the great frontiersmen who believed in God, hard work, and cash, in being second to none, and so could we if we would just listen and obey and sacrifice. And just beyond those days, we woke one morning in our sophomore year in college, the last lambs of the nation of sheep, to see the dream of our future brighten under a banner headline in the photograph of a helicopter gunship smoking human flesh along a muddy road in a place we never heard of called the Republic of South Vietnam. The early 1960s was a unique period in American history. In my experience, it was kind of a brief, idyllic interlude where the world looked very bright and there was a lot of hope for change. There are many issues that had been avoided: wayward youth, civil rights, sexual issues, marriage, poverty, religion, that people were drifting away from because it didn't seem relevant to them. That was the era of the flower girls and rock and roll and new music, and things were changing. Even the Catholic Church was opening up and held Vatican councils to examine its belief systems and practices. There was a wonderful woman in New York named Bella Abzug who always wore big flowing hats, one of the first women elected to Congress, who called the existing establishment a group of fearful little men, very frightened men. The main aspect, the main appearance of that time was basically denial and conformity. That spawned the hippie movement, the rebellion against all of that. And as the war progressed, soldiers coming back from Vietnam brought a lot of things with them. They brought back drugs, herpes, lice. They were different than many of the other people. Many of the hippies looked down upon them, spat on them, called them names, characterized them as being warlike people when they were really not. And as we know, the hippies spread throughout the country. There was a great deal of resentment about them. But I think my most favorite memory of that period of time, very short period of time, were the Flower Girls, whom I've written about in this poem called Wildflowers. In 1965, planets wobbled out of orbit. Red-winged blackbirds chanted Hindi in fields of mountain flowers and loco weed. Peace huddled under army surplus blankets on haiku hillsides. Big-busted, broad-bottomed hippie girls with hirsute mystic armpits and moonshot Eden eyes sprouted in the enchanted woods, cooing mantras, simmering potions, humming the wind, danced without music, naked and spicy under tie-dyed peasant robes, lost goddesses behind no trespassing signs on deserted farms. A pill on their tongues, Indian bracelets jangling, they led us barefoot into new gardens, the other side of the interstate. Yes on their lips, yes to everything, marking the places we shared the universal awe, with tattooed cosmic signs, smiling even as we stumbled away, having no clue the glad gifts they sprinkled over us in acid-bright midnights would be squandered so recklessly. No premonition, the long-stemmed buds they scattered along the unforgiving streets would burst into candle flame, blossom into fists. World War II was a lot different from the Vietnam War in that it was a national effort. There was a real threat to our country. Whereas Vietnam was really, seemed to us, the soldiers in the field, like it was something that was trumped up. We had to wonder, why were we there? I mean, we mingled with the Vietnamese, especially the Mama Sans, and they seemed very innocent to us. Now, I understand that a lot of horrible things were done to American soldiers. I was there when some of that happened. But by that time, they were so jaded by the bombings, the napalm, and the Agent Orange that they themselves had become embittered and cynical. I didn't trust them very much. But during World War II, everyone had a common purpose. One of those persons was a woman who worked in a factory. Her name was Rosie the Riveter, who exemplified the strength and courage of the American worker. This poem is written about a poster that was drawn of her by J. Howard Miller, who drew a number of posters for the Department of the Army, and also about the kind of woman that you might have seen during a Vietnam War protest. It's called The War Effort. In 1942, J. Howard Miller, illustrator, found Geraldine Doyle on a B-2 bomber assembly line, put her on a propaganda poster for the War Production Board that read, "We can do it." Scarf knotted behind her head, sleeves rolled up manly arms, eyes hard with the killer's wish, and she became known in history as Rosie the Riveter. In 1970, during the Vietnam War, I stood next to a young woman known in protest marches as Sister Morning Star, a flower girl in angel white robe, peace lilies in her hair, pumping high a cardboard sign shouting, "We can do what? What?" Historically, soldiers have always come from the lower classes. They were considered pawns or chaff or something to be thrown into battle by kings and presidents, dictators. We sort of felt that way in Vietnam, that we were forgotten. People were watching the war on television. We felt forgotten. And our leaders seemed to be talking privately about themselves rather than about us, despite what they said in public. President Johnson, who did a lot of great things, he passed the civil rights laws especially, which are especially important, talked on his tapes to his friends about, well, what's going to happen to me politically? How are we going to do this and do that? And I understand where he was coming from, because there were other things that he wanted to accomplish beside the war. The war was just sort of in the way. What was hard to understand, though, was why he just continued to pursue it. And, of course, Nixon was the most political, as far as I could see. I mean, it was all about him and what his legacy would be, which is why I came to write this poem. It's called A Place in History. Guardians of the free world wanted a place in history, so they sent us into rice paddies, canteens half full of warm water, heads full of lies. Some who made it back brought lice, rotting feet, herpes, a hunger for highs, half a soul. When our time came to find a place in history, they hid that chapter in the archives so no one would know. Now that the guard has changed, we stand in their place with what we were given, giving them back the scourges they bequeathed to us in arrogance, preserving in our nightmares their grim estate. I've noticed too that studying history, the phenomenon of some of our leaders during the Vietnam War was really not unique to America. It's something that has existed throughout history. And in our current eras, there were men like Mao, Chairman Mao, Joseph Stalin, of course Adolf Hitler, Pinochet in Chile, Batista in Cuba, who seemed like they were bent on declaring war and having war and sending young people to war. During that time, too, of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of criticism by soldiers who'd been in World War II of Vietnam soldiers and of protesters and draft dodgers. And I heard this often, well, if they don't like this country, they should leave it. Or send them off to Vietnam and they'll learn how to be men there, that kind of conversation. So I looked at some of my uncles and my grandfather, and they weren't like that. So I decided, there's two kinds of old men, which I try to describe in this poem as simply called old men. There is a kind of old man who has done his work, plowed up and down freeways or the circumference of a cornfield until the dull light nearly blinded him, heard again the mortar round and slumped over a steering wheel on his way to dinner, on his way home from a war. That old man wishes a boy well, squeezes his shoulder, sets aside tomatoes on the countertop, hands him a vintage rifle to hang above the fireplace, teaches him war is no boy's game, and to be with a woman wisely, he must weather well on the cold days. Another old man resents the swelling of his knuckles, curses the Dianas jogging past as he half steps the boulevard. In his late night wine, he sees the shaving of a soldier's head and rows of bunks in barracks, wishes the boy no better than he had, and prays for worse. That old man demands the end of rock and roll, mourns the rotting of his uniform, the signing of the truth, dreams boys into the Balkans, blackened skylines with waste. Banners in the square only stiffen his leer. His tanks will chew the bodies of the young, even as they chant at his bronze feet. On the day when I was to catch my plane to go to Oakland on my way to Vietnam, I was running very late. I'll never forget this incident when an older man, apparently a veteran, I think he had on some kind of VFW cap, saw me rushing to get to the plane, and my wife was there and my relatives were helping me along, and this is what he said to me, which I'm sure was well-meaning, but it struck me wrong. The poem is called War God. The old man in the ball cap at the Kansas City airport slapped our asses one by one as we ran late for a plane to Oakland Army Base and cheered, "Go get 'em, boys!" And we did. And they did. I flew from Oakland to Vietnam on a commercial airline, Northwest Orient. The stewardesses were Swedish, and they were beautiful, but they hardly said a word to us the entire flight. As we approached Vietnam, we were not able to land because there was a rocket attack at Bien Hoa. We circled the airstrip for the rest of the night. I had not gone to the bathroom for several hours. It was very painful sitting on the plane. When we finally landed, we took a steep dive and into the airport. I thought we were going to crash, but we didn't. We got off the plane and it was extremely hot. The first thing that hit me about Vietnam was the heat and the terrible stench from the latrines, and the mixing with the gas and the oil and the whole bit. There were a number of GIs standing around, Mama-sans, and they made fun of us because we were in dress green uniforms. But the first thing I did when I could was to go to the latrine. It was this rundown brown shack that had about 8 openings in it. So I went in and tried to go to the bathroom. I was sort of blocked from having sat so long. And while I was there, a mama-san came in. And she moved a couple of openings down, and she put her leg up on the board where the hole was and pulled up her pajama leg and shot a straight stream right into the opening. Put her leg down, let the pajama leg fall. Then she turned to look at me and she spat directly into my face. That was my introduction to Vietnam. In country. Fireballs blink on Bien Hoa airstrip. My bladder aches and I'm afraid, but the Swedish girl says, "Stay put." The seatbelt sign is on and pokes out the overhead light. I can smell her mix of tension and perfume, feel the splash of woman hair against my face one last time. We circle, descend, circle, then it's morning, then it's real. MPs rout us off the Northwest Orient into a furnace of burning shit in JP4. Run, run, they shout, run, run. You'll miss the bus to Long Binh. Mama-san's heads wrapped in old cloth lean against wooden posts and yawn. One drags a broom in front of the banner, "Welcome to 4 Corps," and turns to look, and I look away. I didn't know death had such lively eyes. There comes a time in the life of a combat soldier in a battlefield situation when their life changes forever. Sometimes for the better, but mostly for the worse. There are a lot of programs for PTSD, and they're still working on those, but one thing that I've become convinced of is that whatever that change is will never change again. There's a folk song called "Heart Like a Wheel," and a line from it says, "They say that the heart is just like a wheel. Once you bend it, you can't mend it." This poem is about the moment when that happened to me. It's called Viper. The rocket left its tube, smoked through daybreak over the wire, so close to position 28, I could feel its whistle shoot static in my ear, hear the nuts and bolts inside shake down to the road, and a hoarse scream, "Somebody help us over here, God damn it!" And so it arrived. That night, it curled itself around the wooden skid where I slept, dug in so deep I closed my eyes to it. In the village from a distance, it watched me stiffen at the fingers of children pulling at my pockets. Were they children or devils? I wondered too, those old women carrying baskets, which one would strap a grenade to the belly of a boy, send him running at me through the crowd? It raced along the convoy past ARVN soldiers, napping on the hulls of tanks as we moved through the rubber to Dao Chiang, holding our M50s two-handed, ready for an ambush or sniper, ready for another scream. It breathed the rhythm of my breath as I lay awake under the mosquito netting, waiting for the rocket with my name on it to tear open the sandbag roof. I could feel the B-52s shake the ground all the way to Cambodia. It suckered its sour lips against my head and whispered, "Better them than you, AGI. Better them than you." We didn't have showers in Vietnam, but when I was transferred to Cu Chi Base Camp, there was a makeshift shower that was built from a 250-pound bombshell. It had a spigot screwed to the bottom of it and a chain that you could pull and a little stream of water would come out. That's where the Mamasans, who were hired by the Army to run a laundry at the base camp, that's where they scrubbed our clothes by hand in little plastic pans. And while you were taking a shower, they'd stand there and laugh at you and make fun of you. And so it was kind of a nice moment in a way because it was funny. But then there was an incident too where I was trying to shave in a little mirror and I saw a man standing behind me looking without smiling into the mirror. And I thought my moment had come. It turned out that he was the manager or the supervisor for the women. Nothing happened. But these are the thoughts I often had. I think I was able to do that about 3 times in 4 months or so when I was there. This is what I was thinking when I was trying to scrub off and with the water that was left. The poem is called Maidens. Water from a spigot screwed to the belly of a 250-pound bombshell has the sound of Mamasans chattering, dunking fatigues in plastic pans. Nothing I have said will make them go, and I don't care now. I lost my privacy at Fort Carson, Colorado. I ignored their giggles, tried to get wet enough to foam off rice paddy sludge, insect repellent, chocolate bar, dust on mud. The captain saying, last night's ambush, a real success, men. 2 dead, 3 AK-47s, 5 Chicom grenades, knapsacks with maps, bodies punctured by Claymore mines. I was there, I wasn't there, I don't know. The early morning heat, splashing water, women's voices say I wasn't there, say I'm dreaming on a sun porch of a frame house in a Missouri thunderstorm. I haven't seen my body in 6 days, maybe 10. Ivory soap sliding off my chest says I wasn't there. White body, brown face, ghost self with dirt in my nails. Image on Time magazine, CBS. I bathe in the laughter of maidens, bomb water, soap my hands, my scalp, my neck, my legs, my hips, my gun almighty. See mama, all clean, parts still connected. Wake me now and say, I'm already late for school. I knew some soldiers in Vietnam who re-upped for 2nd and 3rd tours, but it wasn't for a reason that I might have imagined. It wasn't for patriotism or because they believed in the war. It's because they had changed so much they didn't feel like they could go back. Some of them who I was in touch with for a while eventually became soldiers of fortune, mercenaries. Some of them got involved with the drug trade. It's a cost of the war that's sometimes hidden, although with the recent emphasis on PTSD, combat fatigue, there's a new awareness of how some soldiers are permanently affected by their war experience. This poem is about one of the soldiers that I knew who is already deceased. It's called Second Tour. There was a first day he battled the angry heat, a stench so foul it gagged him, blood running down his arms where mosquitoes struck, a need for something cold against his throat, so desperate he might have killed for ice. There was the day of his first fire flight, his first tet and first kill, his first buddy to die, roiling stools and spongy feet. The first time he slapped a mamasan to the mud with his rifle butt, and he begged her to give him cause. There was the day his camouflage fatigues hung easy on his ankles. His helmet joined his head, when sea rations tasted just fine. The green towel around his neck, friendly as a muffler against the red ants. When he awoke in the jungle morning, ready and eager. There was the day his orders came to return to the world, when he crouched by the road, waiting for the convoy to pass, one hand around the barrel of his M16, the other squeezing his dog tags, when he turned cold and couldn't stop shaking, when he decided his only choice was to stay. Human beings are famous for hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another. When a soldier in Vietnam got orders to go home, there was a process that we had to go through, returning your clothes, your M16, your other items that you took in with you out into the field. And one of the final things that you had to do was go to a prayer service with the chaplain. Now, my only experience with the chaplain before that was one day in a base camp when we were on stand down, was to just to go talk to him and to tell him that, you know, I have a hard time doing this because I'm a little bit older than the other soldiers. You know, I'm 24 and they're like 18, 19. And I said, I don't think we should be doing this. I think this is wrong. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do when I get back home. I said, you know, I'm not ashamed of anything I've done, but I mean, I just think being here is the wrong thing to do. And I can see why, I said, I can see why a lot of people went to Canada, even if they didn't know what I know or they haven't seen what I've seen. And he said, well, you're in the military, you're in the army, and he says, you've got to do your duty. That's what you need to do, and that's all he told me. Didn't say a prayer with me or say, I understand what you're saying, or maybe that's all he could say, I don't know. But there was really no closure at all about leaving Vietnam, and one day you were there, the next day you were back in the States. It was just like that, it was automatic. I know that when I landed in Oakland, back in Oakland, it was the end of a 29-hour flight without stopping. It was crowded. The bathrooms broke down early in the flight. We got off the plane. It was cold. It was 3 in the morning. It was raining. When you're in a tropical country for a year, and all of a sudden you're in the cold, then you're really cold. It was wet. People were screaming at us to get off the plane, get in formation, marched us in the rain for about 45 minutes. And then all of a sudden after 4 days, all of a sudden I was at the airport, a regular airport in the U.S. It was 6 in the morning, and I was sitting in a chair, and I was in dress greens again. I took off my hat and undid my tie, and I took off my shoes. I had an hour and a half before my flight, and so I fell asleep. The next thing I knew, I was getting a hard tap on the top of the head, and I woke up, and there were 3 MPs standing over me. And they said, get up, get your ass out of that chair. And they pulled me up and pushed me against a wall. Now, people were walking by. They thought I'd done something wrong, I guess. He said, "You're out of uniform." And I said, "Oh," and I didn't know what to say. And so for about a half an hour, they just shoved and pushed me and talked about taking me to the brig and all that kind of stuff. And finally, one of them said, "Well, I'm going to be off in a little while. Why don't we just let him go?" And they took me back. I said, "No, get all this stuff on and do this, do that." And then they left. And I think they just didn't have anything better to do. But that's how I came back to the U.S. But before then, I had to have my visit with the chaplain. And there was a group of about 5 of us. So this is what happened that day, that afternoon. The poem is called Benediction. "Men," the chaplain said, "my mission here today is to pray with you on your departure from the combat area and thank the Lord Almighty you survived this tour without death or maiming injury. But before I get to that, I want to remind you there's a war going on, and it's not going to stop because you got orders. Even now, the North Vietnamese move into the Angel's Wing. Your buddies are being airlifted into a jungle of booby traps, mines, malaria, ambush, and you can help. Sergeant Zygmunt has the forms. Re-up and get a bonus. Don't forget the early out or assignment of your choice. Now let us pray in the names of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and fixed-wing aircraft and the napalm's orange glare. So help you God." During the last 4 months of my tour in Vietnam, I was transferred to 25th Division headquarters, and I worked in the same building where the commanding general was officed, General Williamson. A lot of colonels and majors and other people would come and go during the day, and it would have been funny if it wasn't tragic in a sense, but there were a lot of older officers who'd been in Korea, some of them World War II. These guys strutted around. They had pearl-handled pistols and fancy knives, and they bragged about this and bragged about that. And well, you know, I was at that. I flew over that battle. That was a terrific battle, on and on. And and even today, there are people who were never even in Vietnam who buy medals and pretend they were in the war. They're called posers, fakes. Several celebrities recently have been called for claiming to have been in Vietnam or conflating their participation in the war. In Vietnam, it's estimated there were about 2.7 million American soldiers and service people altogether. A lot of those now are homeless. A lot of them are without benefits. A lot of them have injuries that were never treated. They weren't decorated for anything. Even just being there might merit some kind of attention. This poem is about those colonels and majors and who came in and out to see the general and were bragging about what they did in the field. And I compare them to the soldiers who were actually there on the ground. The poem is called Silver Stars. Some nights they didn't know where they were or why, and didn't care. Prayed the gunships would find their ambush patrol, caught between the Cambodian border and the city of Tay Ninh. When it was over and daylight came, they got Purple Hearts for their trouble, saluted colonels and brigadiers, pitting silver on each other's chests, bragging how tough it was, how brilliant they were, hovering at 1,000 feet. Thinking back more than 40 years after the war, there's still the question, what was the war about anyway? I don't think anyone really knows at this point. At least people who weren't involved with it. And I'm glad they weren't. This poem is called What the War Was About. Some said rubber plantations, some oil, some said gold, some dominoes, some said land reform, some said Reds, some said John, some said Lyndon, some said napalm, some lice, some said herpes, some pot, some said hippies, some pigs. Nobody asked us. This final poem is for people who want to start a war whenever there's some kind of trouble around the world. And they're usually people who've never been in a war. They may have known of somebody who's in a war or heard about a war or watched the war on movies, in movies. When a platoon goes on a patrol, there's a person at the front of the pack called the point man. And generally when the platoon's getting ready to go on a patrol, the platoon leader will say, you do this, you do that, and come to one person and say, you take point. The point man, that's the person that, the first man that leads the platoon to wherever they're going. This poem is called Order of Battle. Memo to the President and Secretary of Defense, senators and congressmen who vote for war but were never in one, generals and colonels who seldom face an enemy soldier eye to eye, men and women over 18 who've never been in combat, mothers and wives proud to send their sons and lovers to die in another country. You want a war? Next war, you take point. And finally, I always like to say this to the soldiers who are not with us anymore. It's like in the Crosby, Stills and Nash song, soldiers who never got older. I've told them all I know. You can rest now.